The dawn was still breathing shadows when the wind blew hard on the dirt road. The dry leaves tangled in the low branches, as if trying to hide what had been left there. It was a red, dry, and forgotten road, where cars rarely passed, and the silence was more constant than the birdsong. But that night, what the silence carried was not peace. It was the weight of two children, wrapped in simple cloths, asleep without knowing that they had been left behind. Their small bodies trembled, not only from the cold, but from the emptiness that was beginning to form, even before they could understand what absence was. There was no shout, no goodbye, just footsteps hurriedly retreating, the muffled sound of slippers on the dirt, followed by a final gesture, a crumpled note pinned to the blanket with a faded ribbon. Forgive your mother. It was all that remained of a presence that had chosen to disappear. There was no name, no explanation, just those fragile words trying to justify the unjustifiable. And there, under the indifferent gaze of the moon and the intermittent song of the crickets, two girls began a story marked by an absence as deep as the night sky. They did not cry, not then. Sleep had confused their senses, and perhaps, in that brief moment, the warmth of each other seemed enough to deceive abandonment. But the earth knew, the earth that knew footsteps returning, and also footsteps that never return. The earth that saw mothers giving birth and leaving, that heard promises and then broken oaths. That red road would become a landmark. There were no human witnesses, but the ancestors, they say, see everything. And perhaps they sighed at that moment, faced with yet another pain planted too early in the heart of someone who did not yet know how to pronounce the word mother. Life began there, not with celebration, not with blessings, but with a silence as heavy as stone. It was a kind of beginning that many would not see as a beginning, but as an end. And yet, even in that abandonment, there was something sacred in the intertwining of small hands, in the warm share between fragile bodies, as if, without knowing it, those girls already had within them an ancient inheritance, not of blood, but of strength, a strength that would come to blossom, not that day, not on that ground, but later, much later, and that later one day would return to touch exactly where everything had been broken. The house seemed to be made of unspoken memories. It was on a flat plot of land, with no trees nearby, where the sun beat down directly and time seemed to stand still. The roof, curved like a tired back, let the rain drip onto the mats where the girls slept. They woke up to the sound of water falling into rusty buckets, learning from an early age that even rest had interruptions. Their father, that man with large hands and dry eyes, didn't talk much. His presence filled the space, but brought no warmth. He was like a permanent shadow on the porch, sitting, staring at the horizon without seeing. They didn't call him father. They didn't know exactly what he was either. A stranger with the same blood, perhaps someone who accepted them, but didn't know how to love them. Their mother's name was never mentioned. It was banned, like a curse. When the youngest tried to ask, she received only a harsh silence, colder than any answer. Since then, words about the woman who brought them into the world have been kept in a corner of their throats, that corner where questions that will never be answered live. So they grew up in a home where food was scarce, but silence was always abundant. Sometimes they would hide under the table, just to listen to the sound of the old radio playing songs from years gone by. It was almost a relief, a way of remembering that the world outside existed, that there was life beyond the leaks, the dented pots, and the clothes drying on crooked wires. The oldest would look out the cracked window and wonder what it would be like to live in a house with the smell of freshly baked bread and the voices laughing. But she said nothing, because too many words were also punishment. Silence was learned as a defense, as an instinct. In that space where love was not visible, they began to create small rituals, a knowing look when they passed each other in the hallway, a piece of cassava saved for the other, a whispered prayer before going to sleep. They did not know how to pray with memorized words, only with a restless heart and silent hope. And even though no one touched it with affection, there was a gentle force between them, like a thread of light that, however tenuous it was, never went out. It was this thread that sustained the gray days and the long nights. And even though the world around them did not know it, something that was already beginning to resist. It was not uncommon to see them walking silently around the house, each with a task in hand, as if service were a possible language where affection failed. The youngest washed the dishes carefully, scrubbing each one as if she wanted to erase the hardships of the days. The oldest cooked, even without knowing exactly what pleased that man who ate little and almost never spoke. Sometimes they drew little letters with colored pencils borrowed from school, folded them neatly, and left them on the table. But the next day, they were in the trash, crumpled between yam peels. There was a stubborn hope in every gesture, as if, at some point, he would realize, as if a small change in his hard eyes could mean that he really saw them. But time passed, and his gaze remained fixed anywhere but on his daughter's faces. Not a smile, not a gesture welcome. He was stone, a stone that breathed, but that did not move with touch, effort, or sadness. And they learned, without anyone teaching them, that love could also be unrequited, that sometimes the strongest love was the one that received nothing in return. At night, the eldest would cry in silence, her face turned to the cold clay wall. She would think about the questions she couldn't ask, the answers that wouldn't come, the hugs she never felt. She would ask herself, without a voice, if she had done something wrong, if, for some reason, she deserved that indifference. And even when the youngest would curl up next to her, seeking shelter in the warmth of her sister's body, nothing could erase the doubt that was slowly emerging, that perhaps the problem was with them, that perhaps, in the eyes of the world, they weren't worthy of affection. But there was something that no one saw, a kind of resistance hidden in every failed attempt, in every well-washed dish, in every meal served with care, a love that, even when rejected, refused to die. They kept trying, even if their hearts ached, even if the response was silence or contempt, because inside them there was a memory that was not yet conscious, the ancestral memory of women who care, who love, who wait. And it was this memory, whispered within, that gave them the courage to continue serving, dreaming, and believing, even when nothing around them encouraged them to do so. It was an ordinary night, one of those when the wind whistles through the cracks in the door, and time seems to take its time. The father arrived staggering, the smell of alcohol preceding his steps. The daughters stopped everything, not out of fear, but out of habit. The silence grew denser, as if the whole house knew something different was approaching. He entered, sat in his usual chair, but this time his eyes were not empty. They were moist, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to come from a place buried long ago. "I was also left," he said, his hand shaking on his knees. The words came out in pieces, like shards from an old jar that he was trying to put back together. He told them that their mother had betrayed him, that she left without looking back, that she left him with a wounded soul and the responsibility of raising two girls he didn't know how to love. He said he tried, but he couldn't, that every time he looked at them, he saw the woman who had abandoned him. He was a broken man, held together by hurts that had become cement around his heart. For the first time, he didn't look hard. He looked tired, human, fragile. The girls said nothing. They sat next to him. There was no accusation, no ready consolation. There was only presence. The youngest rested her head on his shoulder, and he didn't let go. The oldest held his hand, and he let her. What might have seemed small from the outside, inside the house was like the breaking of an ancient dam. For the first time, they saw their father as someone who had also lost, someone who wasn't the enemy, but the survivor of a pain he couldn't name. That night, neither of them slept early. They lay there, in silence, breathing together. And maybe in that moment, something changed. Not because the past was fixed, but because the truths could finally breathe. The weight that each of them carried, he in his guilt, they in their need, began to dissolve, not by the words spoken, but by the space they gave each other to simply exist. Sometimes, the beginning of forgiveness is this, not a request, not an answer, but the courage to show oneself broken and still remain. It was after that day that the house began to breathe differently. There was still silence, there was still pain, but something in the air seemed lighter, as if time had stopped for just a moment to let tenderness enter through the windows. The daughters no longer served out of duty. Now, there was care in their gestures, listening in their eyes. The father, even though he was still trapped by the pain that life had imposed on him, began to notice the small details. The food was warmer. The folded clothes smelled of new soap. The hands that handed him the plate no longer trembled. They offered. The youngest, quiet as ever, began to draw with charcoal on old papers she found around the house. Faces, scenes, memories that she didn't even know were real. Her talent blossomed slowly, like a flower in concrete. The oldest, firm and patient, learned to sew. She mended cloth, transforming pieces into something whole. It was as if with each stitch, she was also sewing up the holes in her own story. Her hands did what words couldn't. They rebuilt. And little by little, the space where they had lived for so long as survivor became home. The father began to water the plants. There were few of them, dried out by drought and neglect, but they were still there. One day, The youngest saw him plant a seedling in the corner of the yard. She said nothing, just watched. That land, once arid, now received a seed of hope. It was symbolic. None of them commented, but they all understood. The transformation was not loud. It was daily, made up of small but insistent gesture. The kind of miracle that no one talks about out loud, but that ancestors recognize as sacred. And then came the smiles. Shy, sometimes hidden behind a spoon or a cloth over the face, but real. The house was no longer made only of leeks. Now, there was also the smell of cornbread, the sound of fearless footsteps and short conversations that didn't weigh anything down. Each new gesture was like a golden thread sewing together what had been nothing but shadow for so long. And although no one said it out loud, everyone there knew they were learning to love. Not like in books or stories, but the way life allows when you insist on staying even after the pain. It was on a Saturday morning, with the sky clear and the smell of wet earth still hanging in the air, that the news arrived. The youngest daughter's painting, made with charcoal and brown paper, had been selected for a state exhibition. A simple portrait of a woman, sitting on the side of the road, looking at the horizon with expectant eyes. It was art born of absence, but brimming with life. She was silent when she received the letter. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just read it slowly and then looked at her father, who at that moment was sweeping the yard, as he had done every day since he learned to take care of it. She approached, held out the sheet of paper with trembling hands, and waited. Her father held the paper as if it were something too fragile for his rough fingers. He read it with difficulty, his eyes running over a line of letters as if crossing a dark river. Then he looked at her, and there, for the first time, he called her my daughter. The words came out softly, shallowly, but they carried the weight of a lifetime contained within. He touched her face with his fingertips, his eyes filled with tears, and for a second she was a child again, but this time welcomed. On the day of the exhibition, everyone was there. Her sister proudly fixed her dress. Her father put on his best shirt, still missing a button. In the audience, he sat in the front row, his hands clutching that loose button as if it were a medal. When her name was announced, he stood up and applauded, his eyes moist with no shame. It was as if, at last, everything had come together. As if the red road, the leaky house, the years of silence and effort had finally found a point of light. It wasn't just a victory, it was a rebirth, an invisible milestone that only they knew about, because there, in front of strangers who only saw a promising artist, were a father and daughter rebuilt, a story that didn't fade away, but chose to flourish. And at that moment, amidst the applause and the sound of clapping, there was something deeper vibrating in the air, the certainty that love, even when it arrives late, can still make a home. It can still heal. It can still be. Time passed as it does in places where healing is not a spectacle, but an everyday occurrence, slowly, without fanfare, like the growth of roots underground. The two sisters, now young women, decided to give a name to what they had experienced, not with regret, but with purpose. They gathered what little they had, sought support where they found a listening ear, and opened a small NGO. They gave a name that came from their own guts, Daughters of the Earth. It was more than a shelter, it was a seed, a place where abandoned girls, as they once were, could find not only a roof over their heads, but also meaning. The simple house became a refuge. There were soft mattresses on the floor, walls painted in warming colors, books lined up on shelves made of recycled wood. But more than that, there was affection, quiet voices that welcomed, hands that didn't demand, eyes that knew how to see. The sisters didn't want to save anyone. They just wanted to offer what they once wished they had, a chance, a space where pain wasn't shameful, but a path, where the past didn't need to be hidden, but transformed into roots. The father asked for help. He didn't ask with words, but with gestures. He started by taking care of the garden, then the windows, then the tools. He became the caretaker of the place, the one who, silently, kept everything running smoothly. And the girls, those who came home injured, began to call him Baba, the old caretaker. He didn't talk much, but he listened. He picked up toys, straightened clothes on the clothesline, fixed creaky doors. In each gesture of his, there was a new way of saying what he once didn't know how to express: love. The NGO grew, but it never lost its soul, because its soul was made of their history, of the red road, of the leaks, of the crumpled letters in the trash. And it was also made of the resilience they learned, of the art that flourished, of the hug that arrived late, but arrived. Each girl who passed by there left something and took something else: dignity, courage, hope. And at the center of it all, The two sisters, side by side, guided not by anger or revenge, but by a silent strength that comes from those who know pain and choose to plant love. It was a warm evening when they decided to return. The two sisters, now strong women, drove slowly along the same road that had once seen them as little girls, wrapped in blankets, left without warning. The earth was still red, still smelled of old dust and dry wind, but they were different. They carried flowers in their hands, roots in their feet, and a reverent silence in their chests. There was no anger in their eyes. There was longing, but not for the pain. It was longing for themselves, for the girls who had survived there, for the exact moment when everything began to be rebuilt. They stopped the car at the same spot, recognizable by the crooked branch of a cashew tree that grew at an angle to the south. They walked to the dirt road with slow, almost ceremonial steps. The father followed behind, his steps shorter, his calloused hands holding those of his youngest daughter. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to explain. That moment was older than any word. The flowers were carefully placed on the ground. Then the eldest daughter dug a small hole with her hands, planted a tree sapling, and covered it with damp earth, as if to say, "Here our story was born. Here our roots are reborn." The father knelt down. A simple gesture, but rare. He touched the ground with his fingers and then brought them to his face. He did not cry, but his eyes were full. It was not regret, it was honor. For the first time, he looked at the place where it all began without running away. He was there, whole, unabashed, and his daughters, standing beside him, did not carry resentment. They carried something more valuable, the knowledge that they had won, not over anyone, but over time, over abandonment, over everything that had tried to erase them. The sun began to set, tinting the sky with shades of orange and purple. The light fell on the newly planted sapling, making it shine like a promise. They stood there for a few minutes in silence, and in that silence there was more truth than in any speech. It was the silence of someone who had found peace, not because they had forgotten, but because they had transformed. The road no longer seemed hostile. It was now memory, living, sacred, fertile, an altar of beaten earth where pain was buried with dignity, and where love, at last, began to blossom. She was sitting under the tree they had planted together, now grown, its branches opening like welcoming arms over the garden. The children ran in the background, amid flowers and laughter, while the smell of wet earth brought back memories of a time when everything was absent. The youngest daughter, in a low voice, said as if remembering and affirming, "The love he didn't have, he learned from us." And in saying this, there was no resentment, just an old truth that finally found rest. The father was nearby, carefully picking up fallen leaves. He no longer needed to understand everything. He just had to be there. He just had to serve. His calloused hands, which had been hard for so long, now knew the value of a gentle touch, of a gesture repeated with intention. The girls from the NGO called him by name affectionately, and he responded with a smile that did not ask for forgiveness, but offered peace. The sisters walked among the small beds lined up, observing the new residents of that place. There was something sacred in the way they listened, advised, welcomed, not because they were saints, but because they knew the path from pain to dignity. And because they knew that sometimes all someone needs is a non-judgmental gaze, a place where they can stop running away. In the shade of that tree, everything ended as it had begun, in silence. But now it was a different silence, not that of loss, but of rest, not of solitude, but of the sacred, because even that which is born in abandonment can flourish, and even a heart hardened by time can learn to love when touched by the insistence of good. Time had passed, but what had been planted there, love, truth, courage, had remained, and it would continue to grow even after the end. If this story has touched your heart, don't go away in silence. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive more real stories of overcoming, faith, and starting over. Stories that heal from within and ignite hope where there was only darkness. Leave a like if something here moved you. Comment telling us what impacted you the most, and share it with someone who might need to hear that it is possible to be reborn, even when everything seems lost. Because when pain is shared, it weighs less, and when hope is spread, it flourishes.